I restore old home movies for a living. That's the actual job title on my invoices: home media restoration and transfer specialist. But what it means, practically, is that people bring me shoeboxes. Shoeboxes, cardboard filing boxes, plastic storage totes from the back of someone's garage. Inside those boxes are VHS tapes, Super 8 reels, High 8 cassettes, Betamax cartridges still in the cases from whatever rental place people used to pretend they bought them from. Sometimes mini DV. Occasionally something older and stranger. A 16mm reel with no label. Or a Kodachrome cartridge that somebody's father shot at a family reunion in 1967 and never had developed. People hire me because someone died. That's not always how they frame it, but that's almost always what it is. A parent, a grandparent. Somebody cleaned out the house and found the tapes and couldn't throw them away, but also couldn't watch them because the equipment to play them doesn't exist anymore in any practical sense. So they find me, usually through word of mouth or a small ad I've kept running in a few local community papers. And they bring me the box, and I digitize everything and put it on a hard drive or upload it to a private link, depending on what they're comfortable with. And I charge them a flat rate per tape, plus a small hourly fee for anything that needs significant repair or cleaning. I've been doing it for 11 years. Before that, I worked in post-production. Nothing glamorous. Logging footage for a regional commercial house, learning the equipment by proximity. When that company folded, I already had a decent capture setup in my spare bedroom and a reputation for being patient with difficult media, so I just started doing it independently. The work suits me. It's quiet, it's methodical. You're mostly alone with someone else's memories, which sounds morbid but isn't. Not usually. Most of what I see is ordinary. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, school plays where someone is always a little out of frame, beach vacations where the camera holds too long on water and then swings abruptly to catch a child running. I've watched probably 40 years of other people's lives in aggregate, and what I've learned is that families are mostly the same. The details change. The sameness doesn't. I'm telling you this so you understand that I'm not someone who startles easily at what comes off old tapes. I've seen plenty of things that weren't meant to be seen. An argument caught on the edge of a frame. A face at a window in the background that nobody at the time noticed. Footage that was supposedly erased but wasn't. Domestic details that families would probably rather not have digitized and preserved forever. I don't comment on any of that. It's not my job to comment. My job is to make the image as clear as it can be made and put it somewhere the client can keep it. I say all of this because I need you to understand that when I tell you what was on one of the tapes, I'm telling you as someone who is not given to misreading what he sees on a monitor. I've been looking at video footage, good and bad, clean and degraded, for over a decade. I know dropout from image corruption. I know what tracking errors look like. I know the difference between a lighting artifact and something physically present in the frame. I want to be very clear about that before I tell you the rest of this. The client was a woman named Pauline Garricht. She called me in late October, maybe 3 weeks after her mother had died. Her mother, Eleanor, had lived alone in the house she and her husband had bought in 1978. And after Eleanor died, Pauline had gone through the house herself, no siblings, it was just her, and found a substantial collection of home video material going back to the early 1980s. She told me she thought there were around 20 tapes, maybe more, mostly VHS with a few High 8 cassettes mixed in toward the later years. I told her my rates. She didn't negotiate, which isn't unusual when someone is still early in grief and just wants the practical things handled. We arranged for her to drop everything off on a Thursday afternoon. She arrived with 2 boxes and an apologetic expression. People often apologize when they bring me a lot of material, as though the volume of someone's recorded life is an imposition. I told her it was fine. We went through the boxes together to take inventory, and I ended up with 23 tapes. Most of them were labeled in a handwriting I assumed was Eleanor's neat, small capitals, a date range, and a brief description. Christmas, 83 to 84. Donna's wedding. Joel's soccer, 1991. That kind of thing. A few were unlabeled, and a few had labels that had partially peeled and were only partly legible. Pauline mentioned her father briefly. His name was Martin, and he had died in 1997. She mentioned it in the context of explaining that some of the earlier tapes would have him on them, and that she hadn't watched any of this material since childhood, and that she wasn't sure she was ready to see it, but also wasn't willing to lose it. She said this very matter-of-factly, the way people say things when they've already cried about them several times and have reached the stage where they can describe the situation without the description breaking them open again. I told her I'd have everything processed within 2 to 3 weeks, and that I'd flag anything that needed her input before I finalized the transfer. She left her contact information and went. I don't usually watch client material in full before I process it. I spot-check tapes to assess condition, play a few minutes from the beginning, a few from the middle, fast-forward through to check for major damage, and then I run the full capture while I'm doing other things, monitoring the levels but not watching the content closely. The actual viewing, if clients want me to organize the footage chronologically or create a highlight edit, happens after. It's more efficient, and it also keeps me from getting absorbed in someone else's family history when I have 4 other jobs running simultaneously. The Garect material looked straightforward. The tapes were in reasonable condition for their age. Eleanor had kept them in a cool interior room rather than a garage, which makes an enormous difference over 30-plus years. Some minor dropout on the oldest VHS tapes, the usual color shift toward red and orange that happens with magnetic degradation, a few spots where the audio would go thin or the tracking would wobble briefly. Nothing that was going to require significant restoration work. I started with the labeled tapes, running them chronologically by date, and got through the first 8 or 9 over about a week without incident. The footage was exactly what I expected. Martin and Eleanor in their 30s, young in a way that must be strange for their daughter to see. A backyard barbecue in what looked like the summer of 1982. Martin holding a beer and laughing at something off camera. A birthday party, Joel's birthday, I assumed. A boy of maybe 5 or 6 with a cake shaped like a train. Christmas footage, the living room decorated with the particular density of ornament and tinsel that was fashionable in that era. Pauline as a child, younger than I would have pictured her, sitting on a carpeted floor, opening presents with the focused seriousness of a child who understands that this is important. Martin died in 1997. Pauline had said this without elaborating, and I hadn't asked. It's not my place to ask. But knowing that date meant I was watching the footage with a mild awareness of a horizon, the way you watch anything when you know it ends at a specific point. At some point in this collection, Martin disappears from the frame and doesn't come back. That's an ordinary thing in this work, but it never quite stops registering. I got through the high 8 tapes from the mid to late 90s without anything unusual. Martin was there in the earlier ones, less often in the later ones. The way people appear less often in footage as children grow older and family life becomes less centered on ritual events. The last tape I found him on clearly was dated summer '96, about 14 months before, presumably, he died. He was at some kind of outdoor event. Looked like a church picnic or a community thing, standing at a distance from the camera, talking to someone I couldn't see. He looked fine. Normal. A man in his late 40s or early 50s, a little heavier than in the earlier footage, wearing a light blue shirt. That was the last I expected to see of him. The unlabeled tapes I saved for last, partly because unlabeled tapes require more attention, and partly because they often turn out to be blanks or partial recordings that didn't merit labeling 2 minutes of a ceiling, half a recording of something that was taped over. I had 4 of them, and I processed them in order, assigning them provisional dates based on the visual quality and the equipment signatures I recognized from the dated tapes. 3 of them were unremarkable. 1 was a nearly complete blank, with only about 40 seconds of actual content. Footage of what looked like the front hallway of the Garrecht house, shot from a low angle. Probably a camera left running on a surface. The other 2 were partial recordings, one that appeared to be from the late 80s, based on the tape stock and color profile, and one that I estimated was from the early 2000s, after Martin would have been gone. A summer afternoon, the backyard, Eleanor gardening alone. The 4th unlabeled tape was the last one I processed. I did my usual spot check, played the first few minutes to assess condition, saw what appeared to be a family gathering, a living room I recognized from other tapes, people standing around talking, and let the full capture run while I went to answer some emails. By the time I came back, about 45 minutes later, the capture was complete. I started the review pass. The tape was a Christmas recording, based on the tree decorations and the specific tinsel style and the clothing visible on the people in frame. I estimated it was from the mid to late 1990s, maybe 1995 or 1996. Eleanor was in frame frequently, visibly in her 50s, her hair the same gray I would have expected. Pauline was there, clearly a teenager, sitting on the couch with the slightly braced posture of someone who'd agreed to participate, but wasn't going to pretend to be enthusiastic about it. A man I didn't recognize at first appeared briefly. Someone's boyfriend or husband, a guest. And Martin was there, moving through the frame with the comfortable ownership of a man in his own living room, talking, adjusting an ornament, at one point bringing Eleanor something from the kitchen. None of that was unusual. If anything, the tape was calmer and better composed than most of what I'd processed from that era. Whoever was operating the camera that Christmas had a steadier hand than usual. What I noticed, and I want to be careful here about the order I noticed things in, because the order matters, was first a date inconsistency. The tape stock and the recording quality were consistent with the mid-90s, which was what I'd estimated before the capture. But there was a brief moment, maybe 40 seconds into a sequence near the middle of the tape, where the camera swung past the television set in the corner of the living room. The television was on, muted, and on the screen was what appeared to be a news broadcast, a talking head shot with a lower third graphic visible for about 4 frames before the camera moved on. I backed up and advanced frame by frame. This is something I do sometimes when I think I've seen something useful for dating purposes. A newspaper headline, a TV broadcast, a car on the street outside a window, anything with a visible date. The graphic was partially legible, a news channel logo I couldn't fully read, and below that, a date. Most of it was compressed into low resolution, the usual softness of a screen within a screen recording, but I could make out enough to read it. The month was November. I was fairly certain of that. The year was less clear, but I could resolve 3 of the 4 digits with confidence, and the 3 I could read were not 1995 or 1996. They were consistent with 1998. I sat with that for a moment. It could be an error in my estimation. Tape stock dating isn't precise, and I'd been working from visual cues. 1998 wasn't impossible, except that Martin died in 1997, and he was on this tape, standing in the living room, adjusting an ornament, talking to his wife, alive and present and unremarkable. I told myself I'd misread the graphic. I ran the frame again. Then I went back and isolated the best frame I could get, sharpened it as much as the resolution would allow, and looked at it for a long time. The year remained what it appeared to be, or close enough to what it appeared to be that I couldn't confidently dismiss it. I finished the review pass and saved the capture. Then I closed the file and sat in my workroom for a while without doing anything in particular. My first working assumption was that the tape was mislabeled by content, meaning it wasn't from Christmas of the year on the broadcast, but that the television had been on and was showing a rerun or a rebroadcast or an archival segment. People had their TVs on as background noise even in the 90s. A news rerun, a year-end retrospective, something being replayed. That was entirely plausible. My second working assumption was that I'd misread the year. Not unusual with degraded footage. I've been wrong before on dating, not often, but it happens. I would have left it at both of those assumptions and moved on, except for one other thing I noticed on the review pass. A detail I'd processed peripherally at the time and only recognized as strange when I was already halfway through closing everything down. Near the end of the tape, maybe the last 10 minutes, there's a sequence where the camera is set down on a surface, a table or a shelf, and left running, the way people did when they wanted to capture the whole room instead of operating the camera themselves. It's a wide shot, slightly high angle, showing most of the living room and part of the hallway leading to the front door. Martin is in the frame for most of this sequence, sitting on the couch talking to someone partially off screen. Ordinary. Normal. And then, at some point in this sequence, he gets up from the couch and walks toward the hallway, and the camera catches him from behind as he moves toward the front door. He does something with the door, opens it maybe, steps partway into the frame of the open door. And then, and this is the part I needed to watch 3 times before I would let myself register it as what I saw, rather than what I might have misinterpreted, and then the door opens from the outside. Not the inside. He wasn't opening it to go out. Someone opened it from the outside. Martin stepped back. The camera angle was such that whoever came through the door was off frame, just outside the visible area. But Martin's reaction, the way he moved, the slight change in posture looked like greeting, like surprise and recognition at once, the kind of body language that says, "You're here. I wasn't expecting you this early." He turned back toward the room, said something I couldn't hear clearly over the ambient noise of the party, and then followed whoever it was further into the house, off frame. I played it twice more, and then I stopped. There was a very obvious rational explanation, which was that a guest had arrived at the party. That was all. A guest at a Christmas party, using the front door, which is what guests do. I was pattern matching onto something entirely ordinary, because I'd already unsettled myself with the date question, and was now looking for corroboration that wasn't there. I saved the file. I started preparing the delivery materials. But I didn't flag the tape for Pauline's attention the way I normally would have flagged a potential continuity issue. I'm not sure I can explain that choice cleanly. I just didn't. I put the tape back in the box with the others and told myself I'd look at it again before I delivered everything. That was a Thursday. By Sunday, I'd looked at it 4 more times. The 4th time I watched it, I was taking notes. Not formal notes, just a legal pad. Things I'd jot down during a review pass when I needed to keep track of timestamps. I wrote down the timestamp of the television shot. I wrote down the timestamp of the door sequence. I wrote down a rough description of what Martin was wearing in the door sequence versus what he was wearing earlier in the tape. That last detail is what made me stop writing. Earlier in the tape, the first 40 minutes or so, the party at its height, People eating and talking and moving through the frame. Martin is wearing a dark green sweater, chunky knit, the kind of thing that was practical in the 90s rather than fashionable. He's got it on in every shot where I can see him clearly, which is maybe 7 or 8 times over the course of those 40 minutes. In the door sequence, the last 10 minutes of tape, he's wearing a gray shirt, a collared shirt, button front, untucked. Not the sweater. He'd changed clothes at a Christmas party in his own house. That's not impossible. People change clothes for all kinds of ordinary reasons. Spilled something, got too warm, went to change at some point during the evening. It's not unusual enough to mean anything on its own. I know that. But when I went back and isolated the transition point, the moment in the footage where the sweater became the shirt, I couldn't find it. One sequence he was in the green sweater. The next sequence, which appeared to pick up in roughly the same part of the evening, based on ambient light and the number of people visible in frame, he was in the gray shirt. I could not find the moment of transition. There was no gap in the tape that I could identify, no obvious cut or splice. Tapes skip. Footage has gaps. This is not extraordinary. I wrote clothing change, no transition visible on the legal pad, and underlined it once. Then I called my friend Dennis. Dennis is not in this business. He manages inventory for a building materials distributor, which has nothing to do with anything. But he was in a film studies program for 2 years before he dropped out in the early 90s. And he still watches more movies than anyone I know. And he has a good eye. More importantly, he is one of those people who responds to information calmly, regardless of what the information is, which was what I needed at that moment. Not alarm, just a second set of eyes. I told him I had some footage from a client job that I wanted him to look at with me, a continuity question. He came over that evening. I showed him the tape. I didn't tell him anything about the date discrepancy or the clothing change before he watched it. I wanted his read without contaminating it. I sat to the side while he watched the full capture on my monitor, and I watched him watch it. He didn't react much during the party sequences. He leaned forward slightly during the television shot, which told me he'd noticed it. When we got to the door sequence, he watched it through once, then asked me to go back and play it again. I did. He watched it again without saying anything. Then he leaned back and rubbed the back of his neck, which is a thing Dennis does when he's working through something he's not sure about. "Who's the guy in the gray shirt?" he said. "I think it's the same man who's in the green sweater earlier in the tape." He looked at me. "You think?" "The build is consistent. The hair. I don't have a clean frontal shot in the second sequence, but the physical profile matches." Dennis turned back to the monitor. He advanced to a frame where Martin was visible in the green sweater, a reasonably clear shot, then advanced to the door sequence and found the best frame of the gray-shirted figure from behind. "I mean," he said. "Yeah. Could be the same guy." "Could be?" He shrugged, not dismissively, genuinely. "The earlier footage is softer, different light. I'd say there's a reasonable chance it's the same person, but I wouldn't want to be definitive about it." He paused. "What's the date on this?" I told him what I'd been able to read from the television graphic. He was quiet for a moment. "And when did the father die?" I'd told him about the client, the general outline, in the process of explaining the job. I hadn't told him when Martin died. "You already know there's a date problem," I said. "I'm asking when." 1997. He looked at the monitor. The timestamp on the footage was sitting at a point well into the door sequence. Martin, or the figure I believed was Martin, was visible from behind, in the gray shirt, in the hallway. Dennis didn't say anything for a little while. Then he said, "The broadcast thing could be a rerun." "I know. Year-end retrospectives, archival stuff. They recycle broadcasts all the time. I know that. And the guy could have changed his shirt for any number of reasons. Right. Those two things together are still probably just coincidence. He said this in a tone that made it clear he was trying to give me the most reasonable interpretation, not that he necessarily believed it. What does the client say? I told him I hadn't contacted the client yet. He nodded slowly. You're going to have to, though. I know. Because if the date on that broadcast is what you think it is, then her father is on a tape from after he died. Yes, I'm aware of what that means. We sat with that for a moment. There's probably an explanation, Dennis said. There usually is. He left around 10. I stayed in the workroom for another hour, going back through the rest of the Garrick material, every tape I'd already processed, looking for anything else I'd passed over on the first review. I found two things. The first was minor, or seemed minor. On one of the HI-8 tapes from 1996, labeled Summer 96, the last tape with Martin I'd already noted, there was a sequence toward the end where someone was filming the backyard from inside the house through a sliding glass door. Eleanor was in the yard, tending something near the fence. The camera was handheld and slightly unsteady, the operator moving around slowly, and at one point the reflection in the glass door was briefly, partially visible. I'd passed over this the first time. On the second look, I paused on the reflection. You couldn't see a face. The angle was wrong, and the reflection was soft, the way reflections in glass are when the focal point is on the scene beyond, rather than on the glass itself. But you could see a figure. Male, I thought, based on height and build, standing inside the house, holding the camera. Martin was in this yard sequence. I'd confirmed that the first time through. He was visible in the background for about 30 seconds before the camera moved on. He wasn't holding the camera, which meant someone else was. Again, not strange on its own. Pauline would have been a teenager in 1996, old enough to operate a camcorder. A guest could have been filming. Any number of people could have been holding that camera. But I went back through every other Hi-8 tape from that era, and in the sequences where I could identify who was operating the camera based on reflections or accidental self-capture, it was almost always Martin. Not always, but predominantly. He seemed to be the one who'd bought the camcorder and considered it his responsibility to document things. So who was filming him in the backyard that summer? I noted it on the legal pad and kept going. The second thing I found was on a tape I'd initially cataloged as Donna's Wedding, which was labeled in Eleanor's handwriting, and which I'd processed early in the job without incident. The wedding footage was straightforward. A ceremony, a reception, the usual chaos of trying to film a crowded event with a consumer camcorder. I'd watched maybe 20 minutes of it on the first pass and noted it as clean and in good condition. What I'd missed, because I hadn't watched the full tape in detail the first time, was at the very end. After the wedding footage ended, there was a gap. Blank tape. Maybe 2 or 3 minutes of nothing. That happens often. People stopped recording and didn't rewind. Left empty space at the end. But after the blank section, there was another recording. A different occasion entirely. Different ambient light. Different room. Someone had recorded over the end of the wedding tape, or recorded something else on the same cassette in a different session. It was brief. Maybe 4 minutes of footage. The setting appeared to be the Garrick living room again, but different from the Christmas footage. No decorations, ordinary lighting, what looked like a weekend afternoon. Eleanor was in frame, seated at the kitchen table, visible in the background, reading something. She didn't appear to know the camera was running. The camera was aimed roughly toward the front of the house, toward the front door. For most of the 4 minutes, nothing happened. The footage was essentially a static shot of an empty hallway with Eleanor partially visible in the background. The kind of thing that ends up on a tape because someone set the camera down and forgot to stop the recording. Except at the 2-minute 40-second mark, someone walked past the camera from behind. Close enough that the motion caused a very brief blur in the foreground before the camera's autofocus adjusted. I couldn't see who it was. A figure moving from one side of the frame to the other, in the direction of the front door. Eleanor didn't look up. The figure reached the front door and opened it and went outside. The door closed. And then the camera sat there for another 1:20 seconds before the tape ended. I had no way to know who that was. The footage was undated. It could have been from any point in the family's time in that house. It could have been Martin. It could have been Pauline as a teenager. It could have been a guest, a repair person, anyone. But Eleanor didn't look up. Not when the person walked past her. Not when the front door opened and closed. She kept reading. I thought about that for a while. If your husband walks through the room and out the front door, you might not look up, depending on the relationship and the moment. If your daughter walks through the room and out the door, same thing. There are 1,000 ordinary explanations for why a woman would keep reading while someone moved through her kitchen and left. But there was something about it that sat wrong with me in a way I had difficulty articulating even to myself. Not the non-reaction exactly, more the stillness of it. The way Eleanor sat there after the door closed, not looking up, not shifting in her chair, as if the passage of that figure through her house was simply not a thing she'd registered at all. I turned off the monitor at 1 a.m. and went to bed, and did not sleep particularly well. I contacted Pauline the following Tuesday. I told her the processing was nearly complete, and that before I finalized the delivery, I had a couple of questions about a few of the tapes. Minor things, nothing alarming. I used the phrase "nothing alarming" deliberately, because it's true that most of the time when I call clients with questions, it's something prosaic. A tape is too damaged to fully recover, or there's material they might want to know about before they view it with family members present. I didn't want her anticipating something significant. We arranged to talk by phone that evening. When she called, I started with the simple question. I told her I'd found some unlabeled material and some secondary recordings on a few of the tapes footage recorded in separate sessions on the same cassette, and that I wanted to confirm whether she wanted all of it transferred or only the clearly intentional recordings. She said she wanted everything. That was what I'd expected. Then I asked about the Christmas tape. I described it generally a Christmas gathering, mid-90s style, living room decorated with a specific tinsel and ornament style I described to her. I asked if she could tell me approximately when that footage was from. She was quiet for a moment. There were a few Christmases we filmed, she said. What does my mom look like in it? I described Eleanor as she appeared in the footage. Hair, approximate age, what she was wearing. Another pause. That sounds like it might be 95 or 96. That was she had that gray streak in her hair from around 94 on. Your father is in this footage as well, I said. Okay. Her voice was careful in the way voices get when someone is preparing themselves. He looks well, I said, which I realize in retrospect was a strange thing to say, but was true and felt necessary. It's good footage of him. I wanted you to be prepared before you watched it. I appreciate that. A pause. Is there a problem with the tape? Not a problem exactly. A small dating inconsistency that's probably nothing. There's a television visible briefly in the background of one sequence, and the broadcast visible on the screen looks slightly later than the mid-90s. It might be a rerun or an archival segment. I just wanted to flag it. Silence. How much later? She said. The year is somewhat difficult to read clearly, I said. It could easily be a resolution artifact. I'm not confident enough in what I'm seeing to give you a definitive date from it. This was true. I was being careful with what I said because I was talking to a woman who had recently lost her mother and had grown up without her father, and I was not going to tell her, based on a partially legible lower third graphic and a wardrobe inconsistency, that I thought there was footage of her father alive after he was dead. Not over the phone. Not without being certain. "Okay," she said finally. "I trust your judgment. Put it in with everything else." We finished the call shortly after that. Practical things, delivery format, the payment balance. After I hung up, I sat at my desk for a few minutes. Then I went back to the workroom and pulled the unlabeled Christmas tape from the box, and I played the door sequence again. Martin in the gray shirt, standing in the hallway, the front door opening from the outside. The figure coming through that door was still off frame, still invisible. Just the door, and Martin's body language, and the particular way he'd stepped back to let someone through. I'd been looking at this sequence for days and focusing on Martin because Martin was the problem, the anomaly, the person who shouldn't be there if my dating was right. I'd been looking at Martin. I hadn't spent much time thinking about who came in. The camera angle on the door sequence was fixed because the camera had been set down, not held. I'd established that early on. Wide shot, slightly elevated, covering most of the living room and the mouth of the hallway. The front door was visible, but at the edge of the frame, and whoever came through it stepped immediately to the left, into the section of hallway the camera couldn't see. What I started doing, and I want to be honest that this was not a quick process, it took the better part of an evening spread across 2 sittings, was tracking the room backward from the moment of the door opening. If someone entered the house at that point, they would have come into the living room eventually. People don't enter a house party and stay in the hallway. So I went back through the door sequence frame by frame, watching the living room rather than the door, watching for a new presence. At the 7-minute mark past the door opening, a figure enters the frame from the left side, from the hallway direction. The figure is a woman. That was the first thing I registered. Medium height, dark hair cut short. She was wearing, I had to look several times to be sure, a black dress, fairly simple, the kind of thing you'd wear to an event where you wanted to look appropriate without effort. She moved through the frame briefly, said something to Eleanor that I couldn't resolve from the audio, and then moved on, out of frame again, to the right. Eleanor's response was warm. I could see it even without being able to fully hear it, the way Eleanor's posture opened toward the woman, a brief touch on the arm, that particular body language of being genuinely glad someone has arrived. I had no idea who this woman was. That wasn't unusual. The Garect footage contained plenty of people I'd never been able to identify, and would never be able to identify friends, neighbors, colleagues, the social periphery of a family's life that doesn't come with labels. It didn't necessarily mean anything. But she'd come in through the front door at the same time as whoever Martin had greeted in the hallway. If she was a new arrival, she'd come with someone. Or directly after someone. I watched the rest of the door sequence 3 more times, looking for anyone else entering from that direction. I didn't find anyone. Just the woman in the black dress, 7 minutes after the door had opened, which meant either she was the person Martin had greeted, which was possible, or someone else had come in the same door a few minutes earlier and never entered the visible frame at all. I put the legal pad away that night. I was starting to feel the particular mental fatigue of looking at something too closely for too long, where everything starts to seem significant, and you lose your ability to distinguish between a real pattern and a pattern you've constructed by selecting which details to pay attention to. I've seen this happen in my work before, usually with clients, not with me. Someone brings me footage and they're convinced there's a figure in the background of one shot, and sometimes they're right, and sometimes they've been looking at a lamp for so long it started looking like a person. The human eye will find a face in anything if you point it in the right direction and tell it to look. I needed to take a break from the tape. I told myself that, and I meant it, and I lasted 4 days. What brought me back was not the tape itself. It was a phone call from a man named Gerald Pruitt, who described himself as a semi-retired archivist and who had gotten my name from a colleague of mine in a city about 2 hours north of here. He was calling about a different job, a collection of 8mm footage belonging to a local historical society that needed digitizing and cataloging. Routine work, the kind of thing I do a few times a year for institutional clients. During that call, in the process of explaining what the collection contained and what they were hoping to do with it, Pruitt mentioned that one of the challenges with the collection was a batch of tapes that had been mislabeled at some point, possibly intentionally, by someone who'd previously managed the archive. Some of the tapes had date labels that didn't correspond to their content. His theory was that the mislabeling had been done to obscure the true age of certain materials, for reasons he hadn't been able to fully determine. I'm not sure why that struck me the way it did. It wasn't a direct parallel, but it settled something in my thinking that I'd been unable to settle on my own, which was this. I'd been approaching the correct tape as a question about the footage. What did the footage show? What was the date? Who was in it? I hadn't been thinking about the tape as an object with its own history, handled and stored by specific people over a specific period of time. Eleanor had kept those tapes for over 25 years. All 23 of them in a cool interior room, reasonably well maintained. She'd labeled most of them herself. She'd decided which ones to label and which ones to leave blank. 4 tapes had been left blank. I'd assumed that was the ordinary result of negligence or of tapes that hadn't seemed important enough to label. But Eleanor had labeled tapes consistently throughout the collection, right up to the late HY8 material from the early 2000s. She labeled the mundane things, the church picnics, the backyard afternoons. She was a labeler by habit. Why were exactly 4 tapes left blank? I went back to my inventory sheet. The 4 unlabeled tapes, in the order I'd processed them. The near blank with 40 seconds of hallway footage. The partial recording I'd estimated as late 80s. The early 2000s tape of Eleanor gardening alone. And the Christmas tape. I pulled up the hallway tape, 40 seconds. Shot from a low angle, slightly sideways, the way a camera looks when it's been placed on a surface that isn't level. The hallway of the Gorecht house, the front door at the far end, slightly ajar. No one in frame. Ambient sound, something distant. Could be a television. Could be outdoor noise filtering through the gap in the door. I'd watched this tape before and registered it as essentially nothing. A camera left running. A boring piece of footage that hadn't merited a label because there was nothing to label. This time I watched it with the sound up. For most of the 40 seconds, the ambient noise was consistent. A low, undifferentiated hum with some higher frequency texture that could have been a television or wind. But in the last 12 seconds or so, there was a change. The sound didn't get louder exactly. It got more directional. Like the source had moved closer to the camera, or like something had shifted in the space between the camera and whatever was making the noise. And then, in the last 4 seconds of footage before the tape went blank, there was a voice. A single word. Male voice. Low, and sufficiently unclear from the recording quality and the distance from the microphone that I couldn't make it out on the first 3 passes. On the 4th pass, with the audio boosted as high as I could push it without the signal collapsing into static, I thought I could resolve it. It sounded like a name. The shape of it was right for a name, 2 syllables. The stress on the first. I couldn't determine whose name. I couldn't determine if it was calling out to someone, or responding to someone, or simply saying a name for reasons I had no context for. The tape ended. 4 seconds of silence, and then the recording stopped. I sat there for a while. Then I pulled up the late 80s partial recording. This one I'd watched before and found unremarkable about 12 minutes of footage. A birthday gathering of some kind. People I didn't recognize. Clearly not the Gorecht living room. A different house. I'd estimated it as late 80s from the visual signatures, and thought it might be footage from someone else's event, possibly a relative or friend's party that happened to end up on an Eleanor tape. This time I watched it all the way through, instead of reviewing it by timestamp. And about 9 minutes in, I saw Eleanor. Younger than I'd seen her in the other footage, noticeably younger, early 40s maybe. She was standing near a wall at the edge of a group, laughing at something. A man was beside her, his back partially to the camera. Then the man turned, and I saw his face clearly for maybe 3 seconds before the camera moved on. It wasn't Martin. I knew Martin's face from 100 frames across 7 or 8 different tapes. I'd spent enough time with his image that I could distinguish him from other men of similar build and coloring without difficulty. This was not Martin. Different jaw, different nose, a little taller. A man of roughly the same age as Eleanor in this footage, which would put him in his early to mid-40s. Smiling, comfortable, close to Eleanor in the particular way that means familiarity rather than obligation. That didn't mean anything. Eleanor had friends, colleagues, a social life that existed before and after Martin. A man standing near her at a party did not constitute anything. But the tape was unlabeled, and it was in the box of Eleanor's personal collection, and Eleanor had been a consistent labeler. I went back to the inventory sheet and looked at the 4 unlabeled tapes as a group for the first time rather than individually. Near blank hallway footage, late 80s party at an unknown location, Eleanor alone in the garden, early 2000s. The Christmas tape. 3 of the 4 showed either an unknown man, an unknown location, or footage that began with someone entering through the front door off screen. 3 of the 4 featured the front hallway, or the front door, in a significant way. The exception was the garden tape, which showed Eleanor alone. I thought about why a meticulous woman would choose not to label something. You label things you want to identify later. You don't label things you have reasons not to name. I drove past the Gerecht house on a Thursday afternoon. I want to be precise about my reasoning for this, because it sounds like the kind of thing you do when you've stopped thinking clearly. And I'm not sure that's entirely wrong, but I also had what felt at the time like a practical purpose. Pauline had mentioned, when she dropped the tapes off, that she was in the process of preparing the house for sale. She'd been going through her mother's belongings. She'd been there several times over the past weeks. I told myself I was driving past on an unrelated errand, which was partly true. I did have a genuine errand in that part of town. The house was a 1970s split level on a residential street, the kind of neighborhood where the houses were all slightly different versions of the same template, different brick colors, different dormers. A real estate sign had been placed in the yard but was still wrapped, not yet posted. One of Pauline's car, a dark green sedan I recognized from when she dropped off the boxes, was in the driveway. I didn't stop. I drove past at normal speed and then kept going and completed my errand. But when I drove back along the same street 20 minutes later, the dark green sedan was still in the driveway, and there was a second car parked at the curb in front of the house. An older model, a gray or silver 4-door. I couldn't tell the make from that distance. Pauline had said she had no siblings. She'd said it in the context of having to handle the estate alone. and she'd said it with the particular flatness of someone stating a fact that is also a weight. I don't know why I noted the second car. I don't know why I noted the color. I drove home. I sat in my workroom. I looked at the legal pad, which now had 2.5 pages of notes, and I looked at the tapes in the box, and I looked at my monitor where the Christmas tape capture was still sitting in the project folder with a yellow flag I'd placed on it, meaning pending client follow-up required. There was one thing I hadn't done yet. One thing I'd been deferring because it felt like the kind of step you can't walk back from. The step that converts a collection of possibly coincidental details into something you are obligated to take seriously. Martin Garrecht had died in 1997. Pauline had told me this, but she hadn't told me anything else about it. Not how, not where, not the circumstances. She'd mentioned it briefly, and I hadn't asked because it wasn't my place to ask. It was, however, publicly available information. Obituaries are public record. Death notices in local papers are indexed, and the paper that would have served this area in 1997 had been digitized and was accessible through 2 different genealogical archives I had subscriptions to for exactly this kind of dating work. I opened my browser. I typed in his name. The obituary came up in the second search result. Martin Howard Garrecht. The date of death was February 14th, 1997. February. Not November, not December. Not at Christmas. Martin Garrecht had died in the middle of February. I stared at that for a moment. The Christmas tape, if the broadcast date was what I believed it to be, was from late November or December of 1998. Martin had been dead for nearly 2 years by the time that party happened. I read the rest of the obituary. He was survived by his wife Eleanor and his daughter Pauline. He was preceded in death by his parents. He had worked for 22 years as an estimator for a commercial roofing contractor. He was remembered by his colleagues, by his church community, by his family. The obituary did not list a cause of death. In 1997, that was not unusual. Many obituaries didn't, but I noticed it. I noticed it the way you notice a room that's been recently tidied too carefully. Every surface clear, nothing out of place in a way that feels like effort rather than habit. I closed the browser. I sat still for a while. Then I picked up my phone and looked at Pauline Garrecht's number in my contacts. It was 7:40 in the evening, not unreasonably late to call. I had the delivery nearly ready. I had legitimate professional reasons to be in contact. I put the phone down. I needed to watch the Christmas tape one more time first. Beginning to end, uninterrupted, sound up, full attention. Not looking for any specific thing, just watching it the way I should have watched it the first time, as a complete object rather than a collection of anomalies to be isolated and examined. I started the playback. I was 40 minutes in, about 10 minutes before the door sequence, when I saw something I had missed on every previous pass. Something in the background, partially occluded by a group of people standing between it and the camera, visible for less than 4 seconds, in a shot where I'd been watching the foreground. It was a framed photograph on the side table near the hallway entrance. The resolution was soft, but the image was clear enough. A portrait photograph, the kind you get taken at a studio. A man, a woman, what appeared to be a formal occasion. The woman was Eleanor. The man beside her was not Martin. I backed up and advanced frame by frame through that section until I had the clearest single frame I could isolate. The photograph was partially blocked. One of the guests in the foreground, a woman in a red top, was standing at an angle that cut across the lower left corner of the frame, and the side table was far enough from the camera that the portrait's details were compressed into soft shapes rather than crisp edges. But the composition of the photograph was legible. 2 people, formal posture. the kind of arrangement you see in engagement portraits or anniversary photographs. Eleanor I recognized from the tape itself, from the other tapes, from the consistent way her face had indexed in my memory over 2 weeks of processing. The set of her shoulders, the shape of her face, the way she held herself in photographs versus in candid footage, it was her. The man beside her was taller than Martin. I was nearly certain of that, even accounting for the resolution loss and the angle. Martin was average height, and in photographs he tended to stand with a slight lean toward whoever was beside him, a habitual posture I'd seen in several of the formal shots across the other tapes. The man in this portrait stood straight, different build, broader through the chest. I saved the frame. I enhanced it as much as I could without introducing artifacts that would distort what was actually there rather than clarify it. What I ended up with wasn't much better than what I'd started with. The distance was simply too great for the camera's resolution to give me a clean image. But I had a face shape, a height, a posture. I pulled up the late 80s party tape. The man standing near Eleanor at the edge of the group, the one who had turned and given me 3 clear seconds of his face. Same height, same build, close enough. I wasn't certain. I want to be precise about that. I was looking at degraded footage from 2 different tapes, 2 different decades, and making a comparison based on limited visual information. What I had was consistency. What I had was a man who appeared to be in Eleanor's life across multiple pieces of footage that Eleanor had not labeled, at events Eleanor had not identified, in a photograph that was sitting on Eleanor's side table at a Christmas party that happened after Martin was dead. What I did not have was a name, or a clear explanation for why Martin was also at that party, unless. I made myself think it through slowly. I didn't want to land on the obvious conclusion, because the obvious conclusion felt simultaneously too simple and too complicated. And I'd been wrong about simple conclusions before in this work. Martin Garrick died in February 1997. The Christmas tape was, based on the broadcast visible on the television, from late 1998. Martin appeared on the tape, but the tape also contained a photograph of Eleanor with a man who wasn't Martin, and it contained a figure entering through the front door, who Martin appeared to greet with the body language of recognition and welcome. And it contained a woman in a black dress who arrived from the same direction and was met warmly by Eleanor. What if it wasn't Martin? Not a supernatural persistence, not footage from after his death in any uncanny sense. What if the man in the gray shirt, in the second half of the tape, in the door sequence, what if he only resembled Martin because I'd been primed to see Martin? What if I had done exactly what I'd warned myself against? Selected details that confirmed a pattern I'd already decided existed. The man in the gray shirt had never shown me his face. In the door sequence, he was filmed from behind. In the subsequent footage, such as it was, he was at the edges of frames, in motion, never in a direct, clean shot. I'd assumed it was Martin because Martin was the puzzle I'd already committed to solving. I went back to the earliest clear footage of Martin, the 1982 barbecue, and I watched his movement. The way he walked, the way he held a drink, the slight characteristic gesture of touching the back of his own neck when he was listening to someone. Then I went to the door sequence and watched the gray-shirted figure move through the hallway, the brief seconds of him visible before he went off frame. The neck gesture. The gray-shirted figure didn't do it. Couldn't, because he was barely visible long enough. But his walk was similar. His build was similar. I stayed with the question for a long time and couldn't resolve it, which told me I needed to stop trying to resolve it from the footage alone. I called Pauline the next morning. It was a Saturday. I told her the processing was complete and that I'd like to deliver the materials in person if she had time, that there were a few things I wanted to walk her through, rather than just leaving notes with the drive. She said she was at the house that afternoon, if I didn't mind meeting her there. I drove over with the hard drive, the original tapes in the box, and the legal pad face down on the passenger seat. I didn't bring the legal pad in. I wasn't sure yet what I was going to say, and I didn't want props that made it look like I'd been building a case. Pauline met me at the door. The house was partway through being cleared, some furniture still in place, boxes stacked along one wall of the living room. That particular disrupted quality of a space in the process of being dismantled. She looked tired in the way that people look when they've been doing physically and emotionally demanding work for several weeks without adequate rest. We sat at the kitchen table. I handed her the hard drive, explained the folder structure, the file formats, the backup protocol I recommended. Practical things first. She asked a few questions, and I answered them. Then I said I had a couple of questions about the unlabeled tapes. She nodded, her hands around a mug of coffee. I described the Christmas tape again, more fully this time. The party, the approximate date, Martin in the first half of the footage. I told her I had some questions about the date discrepancy I'd mentioned on the phone. How much of a discrepancy? She said. The broadcast visible on the television is consistent with late 1998. If that's accurate, the footage is from about a year and a half after your father passed. She looked at her coffee. A long moment. Okay. I wanted to ask if there's any possibility that the tape is from before his death, and the date I'm reading is from an archival segment or rebroadcast. Late 1998, she said. Not quite like a question, more like she was testing how it felt to say it aloud. That's what the footage suggests. I could be wrong about what I'm reading. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He does look like my dad." I kept my voice level. "You've seen the footage?" "No, I haven't watched any of it yet." She paused. "I'm sorry. I should have said that differently. I meant, if there's a man in the footage from that year, in that house at Christmas, that you're telling me might be my father." She stopped, set her mug down. "He does look like my dad." I waited. "There was someone," she said, "after my father died. My mother, she had someone. For a while. He was around for maybe 2 or 3 years, and then he wasn't anymore." She looked up at me. "I was never told his name. I mean, I'm sure I was at some point. I was 16 when my dad died. I would have been introduced, but I don't remember it. I think I made a decision not to keep it." "He resembled your father?" She exhaled, enough that it bothered me, which is probably why I don't remember his name. A pause. I wasn't kind about it. Looking back, my mother she was lonely, and I wasn't kind about it. And then I went to college, and by the time I came back, he was already gone. We never talked about him. She never brought him up, and I never asked. I thought about the photograph on the side table. Did your mother have any formal photographs taken with him? Studio portraits, that kind of thing. Pauline looked at me for a moment with a slight change in expression, the kind of shift that means someone is deciding whether to answer a different version of the question than the one you asked. "There was a photograph," she said, "on that little side table in the living room. My mother had it there for a while, and then it was gone. I don't know what happened to it." "When you were going through the house in the past few weeks, did you come across it?" "No." Simple. Direct. I looked. I thought I'd find it somewhere. She glanced toward the living room, toward the remaining boxes. It wasn't here. I gave her a moment before I continued. I told her about the late 80s tape, the party at the unknown location, Eleanor visible at the edge of a group, a man beside her. I described him as precisely as I could, without leading her toward the description I already had in my head. "That sounds like it might be my aunt's house," Pauline said slowly. "My mother's sister. She lived in Glenbrook. We used to go there for it. They had a thing every New Year's. She frowned. But my dad hated those parties. He almost never went. This tape would be from that approximate period, late 80s. So if my dad wasn't there, she didn't finish the sentence. The man in that footage, I said carefully, appears to be the same man visible in the photograph on the side table, based on height and build. The footage isn't clear enough for me to be certain, but there's a resemblance. She was very still. Not the stillness of shock exactly, more the stillness of someone fitting a thing into a shape they'd already half prepared for it. You're telling me my mother knew him before, she said, before my dad. I'm saying the footage is consistent with that. I could be wrong. But you don't think you are? I didn't answer that directly. I told her there was one more thing, and I pulled out my phone where I had the enhanced frame saved the best image I could get from the portrait on the side table, and I placed it on the table between us. She looked at it for a long time. The image was soft, the faces compressed into impressions rather than details. But she was looking at it with the focused attention of someone who'd seen this face before, who was measuring it against a memory. That's the table in the living room, she said quietly. I recognized the lamp behind it. Yes. She kept looking at the photograph on my phone. Then she said, very quietly, he came to the funeral. I waited. There was a man at my father's funeral who I didn't know. I remember thinking he was standing too close to my mother, and I was angry about it. And I assumed he was someone from her church or her work or something. And then after, she stopped. After, he was around. Not living there, not like that. Just around. At dinner, sometimes. At the house. She looked up at me. I always thought I assumed my mother met him through grief, through loss, the way people sometimes do. But if he was at the New Year's party at your aunt's house in the late 80s, then she'd known him for years. She said it flatly, without visible emotion, which I recognized as the specific flatness of an emotion too large to express in front of someone you barely know. It's possible this is all coincidental, I said. Footage I've misread, a resemblance between different people. You don't believe that? I believe it's possible. What do you think actually happened? I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the unlabeled tapes, the deliberate absence of labels, the careful non-naming of things, the portrait that had been on the side table and then had disappeared, the Christmas party on a tape left blank, a party that happened when Eleanor was newly widowed and a man she'd known for at least a decade was, apparently, in her home. I think your mother kept some things separate, I said. I think she was careful about what she labeled and what she left unnamed. And I think she held some things privately, for reasons that belong to her life in ways that go back further than 1997. Pauline was quiet for a long time. The house was quiet around us. That particular silence of a place being slowly emptied, objects losing their context. My dad, she said finally, in the Christmas tape, you said he was in it. A man who resembles your father, in the first section of the tape, before the door sequence. But you said the tape is from 1998. Based on the broadcast, yes. So, either you're wrong about the date. She said it carefully, not accusingly, working it through. Or you're wrong about it being my father. One of those things is likely true. She looked at me. Which one do you think it is? I looked at the table. I thought about the gray-shirted figure, the back of a man moving through a hallway, the specific posture I'd spent 2 weeks analyzing. I thought about what it means to see what you're primed to see versus what is actually there. I think, I said slowly, that the man in the second half of the tape, the door sequence, might not be your father at all. I think he might be the same man who was at the New Year's party, and at the funeral, and in the portrait. And I think the man in the green sweater, in the first half of the tape, the man I've been assuming was recorded on the wrong side of the date. I stopped. "What?" she said. "Pauline, I need to ask you something directly. Your father's obituary doesn't list a cause of death." The silence that followed was different from the previous silences, more specific. "No," she said. "It wouldn't." She looked at her hands on the table. For a moment, I thought she wasn't going to say anything else. "It was his heart," she said. "That's what we were told. That's what the death certificate said." She paused. He was 53 years old, and he had no history of heart problems. And my mother found him. Another pause. Longer. My mother found him. And there were questions at the time from his sister, my Aunt Renata, who she never accepted the explanation. She and my mother didn't speak again after the funeral. She looked up. I chose my mother. The kitchen was very quiet. "I was 16, she said. "She was my mother, and I was 16, and I chose her." I didn't say anything for a while. There wasn't anything to say that wasn't either too much or not enough. And I've learned over the years that silence after something like that is better than filling it with words that are really just your own discomfort looking for somewhere to go. Pauline sat with her hands around the mug. She wasn't crying. She'd passed through whatever threshold crying requires and come out the other side into something quieter and harder. After a while, she said, "What does the footage actually show?" "In the first half of the tape, the man in the green sweater. A Christmas party. Your mother. Some guests I can't identify. A man who resembles your father strongly enough that I believed it was him on initial review. He's relaxed. He moves through the space like it's his house." I paused. "Or like he's comfortable in it." "But you're not sure it's my father?" "I was sure when I first watched it. I've become less sure." She nodded slowly. "Because of everything else." "Because of everything else." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Could you tell if it was him? If you had a better image to compare?" "Possibly. If you have photographs of your father from around that period, formal ones, I could do a more careful comparison. It wouldn't be forensic, but it might be more definitive than what I have." She got up from the table without saying anything and went toward the hallway. I heard her moving through the house, a door opening, the sound of a box being shifted. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the living room from where I was sitting, at the side table near the hallway, where a lamp sat with nothing beside it. She came back with a photograph in a cardboard sleeve, an actual print, the kind you got from a drugstore, a 4x6. She set it on the table in front of me. Martin Garrecht, mid-90s by the look of it, standing in what appeared to be a park. He was squinting slightly against the sun, wearing a light jacket, half smiling in the way people do when they're not sure whether the camera is ready or not. Ordinary and specific, the way photographs are when they're taken without intention. I looked at it for a while. Then I pulled up the Christmas tape footage on my laptop, the clearest frame I had of the man in the green sweater, and I put them side by side. The resemblance was strong enough that for most of the past 2 weeks I hadn't questioned it. Same general facial structure, same coloring, similar age. But the man in the green sweater had a fuller face. Martin in the photograph was lean through the jaw. The man in the green sweater wore a ring on his right hand that caught the light in one frame. Martin, in every photograph I'd seen across 8 or 9 tapes, wore his ring on his left hand where a wedding ring belongs. I hadn't noticed the right-hand ring before. I'd been looking at faces. I pointed this out to Pauline without editorializing. Just the observation, ring placement, and the slight structural differences in the jaw. I let her look. She looked for a long time. "That's not my father," she said. She said it quietly. The way you say something when confirming it out loud is the last step in a process that's been happening privately for longer than the conversation. No, I said. I don't think it is. So the man in the green sweater is someone else. Someone who resembles him enough that I made an assumption. Someone at my mother's Christmas party in 1998 who looked like my father. She set the photograph of Martin down on the table. Someone she apparently knew well enough to have at her house 18 months after. She stopped. I thought about what that meant. A man who resembled Martin enough to be mistaken for him on degraded footage. Present in Eleanor's home at Christmas, less than 2 years after Martin's death. Not named on any of the tapes. Not visible in any of the labeled footage. I thought about Renata, the aunt who hadn't accepted the explanation, who'd stopped speaking to Eleanor at the funeral. I thought about what it would mean to find a man who looked enough like your dead husband that home video footage could confuse the two. What it would mean to have known him for years before your husband died. What it would mean to have him in your house by December of the year. Your husband died in February. I wasn't going to say any of that. It wasn't my place, and it wasn't my knowledge, and I had no actual evidence beyond footage that I'd already demonstrated I was capable of misreading. But I thought it. There's something else, I said. The photograph that was on the side table, in the tape, in the background. The one I couldn't find. Yes. I turned my laptop toward her and played the sequence slowly, frame by frame, until I had the best frame on the screen. This. She leaned forward, looked at it for a while. My mother put that up, she said. I remember being angry about it. I thought it was disrespectful to my father's memory to have a photograph of herself with another man on display in the living room. A pause. I said something to her about it. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I remember her face. She put it away after that. When was this? I was in college. So, 2000, 2001, around there. She looked at the soft shapes in the photograph on the screen, the two figures, the formal posture. She never put it back up, and when I came back to clean out the house, it was gone. She may have kept it somewhere you haven't found yet. Maybe. She didn't sound convinced. Or she got rid of it before she died. Tied things up. She was toward the end. She was very deliberate about what she left behind. A small, complicated expression crossed her face. I thought that was just her being organized. She'd always been organized. I thought about the unlabeled tapes. The organized woman who labeled everything she wanted found and left, blank the things she didn't want named. The man, Pauline said, in the green sweater. Do you think my mother knew he looked like my father? The question sat on the table between us. I don't know, I said. And then, because she deserved more than a deflection, probably. She nodded, just once. We sat there in Eleanor's kitchen in Eleanor's half-emptied house, and I thought about what it costs to keep a secret for 25 years. The particular maintenance of it. The daily work of not naming things, of leaving cassettes blank, of putting a photograph away when your daughter objects and not putting it back, of being organized about what you leave behind. Eleanor had died leaving the tapes in a cool room, well preserved, labeled and unlabeled in a specific pattern. She'd left them for Pauline. She'd known Pauline would bring them to someone like me. Maybe she'd known exactly what she was leaving. Maybe she hadn't. People don't always make deliberate choices about what their archives contain. Sometimes the archive just is what it is. The accumulation of what you filmed, and what you kept, and what you couldn't throw away. But I kept coming back to the unlabeled tapes. 4 of them. Kept, not thrown away. Unlabeled, not identified. left for someone to find. I gave Pauline the hard drive. I gave her the original tapes in the box. I wrote down the timestamp of every sequence I'd described to her, clearly, on a piece of paper, so she could find things without having to search. And I put that paper in the box with the tapes. She walked me to the door. At the door, she stopped and said, "The voice on the short tape, the hallway footage, you said there was a word." I'd told her about the 40-second tape during our walkthrough, the low-angle hallway shot, the voice at the end. I'd told her I couldn't make out what it said clearly. "You said it sounded like a name," she said. 2 syllables. "I think so. The audio quality is poor enough that I could be wrong about that." She looked at me. Could it have been Eleanor? I thought about the sound, the shape of it. 2 syllables. Stress on the first. Eleanor is 3 syllables. "No," I said. "It wasn't Eleanor." She nodded, as though I'd confirmed something she'd already worked out. "Renata," she said. "My aunt's name. That's 2 syllables." She looked out past me at the yard, the real estate sign in its wrapper, the quiet street. She called here sometimes, after everything. My mother wouldn't answer. I remember hearing the phone ring and watching my mother not pick it up. I didn't ask whether she thought it was Renata's voice on the tape. I didn't think she knew, and I didn't think my asking would help either of us. "Will you contact her?" I said. "Your aunt. I don't know if she's still alive." A pause. "I could find out." She said this the way people say things they've already decided, and I recognized it, so I didn't push further. I drove home, made coffee, sat in the workroom for a while in the specific quiet of a project that's been delivered, the particular absence of something that's been occupying your attention and is now gone. The room still had the legal pad on the desk, 2.5 pages of notes, timestamps and observations and questions. I looked at it for a while, and then I tore the pages out and put them through the shredder. Not because I was hiding anything, just because they were working notes, and the work was done, and some material doesn't need to be kept past its usefulness. I thought about the man in the green sweater, standing in Eleanor's living room in December 1998, 10 months after Martin was in the ground, comfortable in the space, moving through it with the ease of someone who had been there before and expected to be there again, wearing a ring on his right hand. Looking from a distance on degraded footage, like someone he wasn't. I thought about Eleanor keeping that tape, keeping all 4 of those tapes, maintaining them the same way she maintained the labeled ones, the same cool room, the same careful storage, not throwing them away even when she was apparently being very deliberate near the end about what she left behind. I've thought about this part more than any other, the decision to keep them, because the simplest interpretation that Eleanor kept the unlabeled tapes carelessly, without considering what they contained, doesn't fit the woman visible in 23 tapes across 20 years of family life. Eleanor was precise. Eleanor labeled things. Eleanor made decisions. So either she kept those tapes without reviewing them, which is possible. People do that, store things without examining them because the examining is too much. Or she kept them knowing what was on them and made a choice that they should survive her. I don't know which one it was. I don't know if Pauline will ever know either. What she has now is what I gave her the footage, the timestamps, the question. What she does with it is hers to decide, not mine. That's true of all the material I handle. I transfer it and I deliver it, and it belongs to whoever brought it to me. I've watched 40 years of other people's lives, and I've kept exactly none of it, because none of it belongs to me. Because my job is to make the image as clear as it can be made, and put it somewhere the client can keep it. The direct material is the only job I've ever finished, and then sat in my workroom thinking about afterward. not because of the horror I'd initially constructed around it. The ghost story I'd started building before I understood what I was actually looking at. What I'd actually been looking at was ordinary. The ordinary horror of a marriage and what lives inside it. The ordinary care a woman took to simultaneously protect a secret and leave it survivable. The ordinary damage that passes from a parent to a child, not as a single blow, but as a series of small, illegible things that only become readable from a distance. I'd been looking for a ghost, and I'd found something that was in some ways worse. A life that continued, and the careful work of containing it. A few weeks later, I got a short email from Pauline. She said she'd found her aunt. Renata was in her late 70s, in an assisted living facility in another state, and her memory was not what it had been, but she was alive. Pauline said she was going to visit. She didn't say what she expected to find, or what she hoped Renata would tell her. She just said she was going. She thanked me for the work, and she signed her name, and that was all. I read the email twice, and then I went back to work. There was a new box on my desk, another family's shoeboxed decades, and I had 3 other jobs queued ahead of it. I do this work because I'm good at it, and because it suits me, and most of what I find is ordinary, and ordinary is most of what there is. But I do find myself sometimes, when I'm running a capture and monitoring the levels, glancing at the screen when I normally wouldn't, just looking, checking whether the footage is what it's supposed to be. It always is. So far, it always has been. I check anyway.